sociópata.
Sociopath. According to the Inter-American Society of Psychology, sociopathic individuals display an antisocial personality characterized by a lack of empathy, disregard for social norms, impulsiveness, and irresponsibility, but also by a remarkable ability for deceit and manipulation. The definition fits perfectly with the figure of the Argentine president, Javier Milei. His first 2 years in office were marked by economic recession, deindustrialization, indebtedness, cuts in social investment, repression of protests, and to top it off, corruption scandals. Nevertheless, in the recent midterm elections, 40% of Argentines supported Milei with their vote.
De los argentinos acompañaron a Milei con su voto. ¿A qué responde esta
What explains this enigmatic situation? Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin broadcast number 297 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship, as well as through subscriptions, memberships, and our PayPal account. This time, we're joined from my homeland by Mr. Nicolás Lantos, journalist for El Destape, political analyst, author of a fascinating podcast called Estado de Malestar, and in my view, one of the most insightful political analysts in Argentina. Nico, my friend, how's everything over there?
Ezequiel, thank you very much for the invitation and for your generous words.
I want to start, Nico, with a short video clip, because we're joined by many demolishers, as we call our followers, in Argentina, but also many demolishers from Spain, Mexico, the United States, Colombia, and many other countries. Naturally, they're aware of the political situation in general, but perhaps not so familiar with the characteristics of the figure Javier Milei. So, I wanted to begin by simply showing 30 seconds or a minute of something that happened in 2022, on a radio show, when Milei was responding to none other than a question about the sale of children. Let's take a look.
Would you agree with the sale of children? Back to this. It's like there's a wonderful book called General and Competitive Analysis by Arrow and Hahn. It's from '71. Arrow later got the Nobel in '72 with Hicks. When those guys wrote that, they said, look, we're writing this because it has certain normative properties. And in those certain normative properties, that's the kind of world I'd want to move toward. But then there's the real world. But the answer isn't no. If they ask you, you don't agree with the sale of children. No, because it depends. Let's say it depends on what terms you're thinking about it.
But the reproduction sale of children, it depends. It depends. A year before the elections. So let's start from the beginning. How could a madman like this, a guy in favor of selling children, organs, a guy supposedly in contact with the spirits of his dead dogs through a medium, how could someone like that win in a country like Argentina the presidency of the nation?
The short answer is to look at how bad things were, that someone like Milei could become president of the nation. I remember that in 2016, during the election campaign, before Trump reached the presidency of the United States for the first time, I think while he was sweeping the Republican primary, he gave an interview where he said while in Trump Tower in New York, in his top floor office, I could take the elevator, go down to Fifth Avenue, shoot someone in front of everyone, and they'd still vote for me. And he wasn't entirely wrong, because in that election they did end up voting for him. He didn't win the popular vote, but enough people voted for him to win the election, according to how the rules were set up. 4 years later he lost, but he gained 10 million more votes. And 4 years after that he returned to the presidency, I believe, for similar reasons. A deep social disillusionment with what had existed up to that point. And I don't mean just the immediate past. Although in Milei's case, it's worth remembering that by the time the election came around, inflation was running at over 20% per month. It was a traumatic enough situation to explain something like that, but rather it reflected the prolonged failure of a system, not just of a single party.
Prolongado de un sistema y no solo de un partido. En Argentina veníamos de 4 años de un gobierno.
In Argentina, we came from 4 years of a government led by the Frente de Todos, the most liberal wing of the Peronist coalition under Alberto Fernandez. Before that, there were 4 years of a pro-government with Mauricio Macri, and before that, 4 years of a government under Cristina, which although comparatively, and especially with the benefit of hindsight, was in terms of magnitude much better. We had the highest minimum wage in Latin America, and today we have the lowest. But even then, there was already a sense of wariness after 10 years of Kirchnerist rule, due to a series of economic measures that were unpopular with the public, and because of media harassment through corruption allegations or even violence, as in the Nisman case, which obviously also played a role. So I think such a widespread and deep disillusionment led people to vote for Milei the way they did. I insist, just like Trump in the United States or at the time the Five-Star Movement in Italy, something that some have described as a slap in the face to politicians, which let's say took on a different form in each country. That would be the most direct answer I could give, beyond the fact that obviously one can then get into a lot of nuances. Why Milei and not someone else? The mistakes made that led to this. But I think Milei should be understood as part of a global wave of far-right leaders who were elected in response to the failure of the previous political system, so to speak. With one caveat, that the beneficiaries of this new system and those of the old one are the same, and that in any case, what is happening is a deepening of the deterioration of workers' economic ability to retain wealth, in favor of capital accumulation at the top of the pyramid, concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and in an increasingly disproportionate way.
Well, that widespread discontent, not only in Argentina, with the particular characteristics of the Argentine situation, but also in the United States and other countries around the world. You just mentioned Italy. What does it stem from in a deeper analysis, beyond the obvious growing inequality? What is in crisis behind all this that leads to these outbursts?
Look, it seems to me, or the way I think this era should be analyzed, is as a time where there's an overlap of crises. There are economic, political, institutional, social, health, technological, labor, and climate crises. We practically live in an age of permanent crisis, as contradictory as that may sound. And these crises have two unavoidable characteristics. One is that their effects accumulate and even feed back into each other. Climate crises cause displacements, which generate social crises, which in turn often provoke, for example, xenophobic reactions to those displacements. And that creates political crises. It's all interconnected. But the second feature that for me is central is that all these crises function like the solar system. They are concentric crises. At the center, there's an issue that explains them all. It doesn't fully explain each one, but none of them can be understood without it. And that is the concentrated accumulation, like never before in history, of money, but also of power. Because the richest people on the planet are at the same time the owners of the platforms on which our lives unfold, and of a technology that allows not only the analysis of each of our behaviors, but also the use of that data to manipulate us. And this isn't a conspiratorial view, even though it might sound like I'm wearing a tinfoil hat, but rather something that these very same companies acknowledge in their internal documents, something governments also recognize as they try to figure out how to deal with it in the best possible way. Yet, for some reason, it still isn't part of the common knowledge of the people who should be, well, more informed about the world they live in and the platforms they operate on. These mechanisms of control are above all very opaque. So I think that's where the core of these crises lies.
Ahí está el núcleo de esas crisis. De todas estas crisis que se superponen, se retroalimentan y se acumulan.
Of all these overlapping, self-reinforcing, and accumulating crises. Because you can name any of the emerging problems, from the far right to climate change, new technologies, or the end of work, and they all have as their epicenter this new techno-oligarchy, as some call it. I also like to talk about a lumpen oligarchy, because they end up sharing with the lumpen proletariat that characteristic of being declassed and stateless. They don't respond to the interests of any class or nation, but are instead a caste unto themselves.
Ni una clase ni de una nación, sino que son en sí mismo una casta. Sí, en este caso la definición más absoluta de casta.
Yes, in this case, the most absolute definition of a caste. And with the aggravating factor that they created a system that feeds on itself in a spiral, where the more inequality there is, the more power, and the more power, the more inequality. And what we are seeing is exactly that spiral, that descent down the spiral. And about that, two more little things to keep it short. On one hand, going back to the original question of why they win. If you look at the electoral results in the West over the past 5 years, the general trend is that oppositions win. It's very difficult for a government to be re-elected.
La característica generalizada es que ganan las oposiciones. Es muy difícil que un gobierno se revalide. Es decir, claramente hay un...
That is to say, there is clearly a structural discontent that goes beyond who governs, whether right or left, and that has to do with an expectation placed on a democratic system that no longer has the power to fulfill that expectation. Because that power is now in private hands, in corporate hands. That's on one side. And on the other, there's a brilliant observation made a quarter of a century ago by Guillermo O'Donnell. Look, the first episode of the podcast begins with a metaphor that Guillermo O'Donnell used in 2001 when Argentina was falling apart, and he was talking about the country's political crisis at that time. But it anticipates the political science of the last quarter century.
Pero anticipa la ciencia política del último cuarto de siglo. Porque lo que dice él es la democracia.
Because what he says is that democracy is like a house that no longer collapses all at once from an earthquake, but rather like a house whose foundations have been eaten away by termites. Very gradually, rights are lost, democratic mechanisms are lost without us realizing it, until one day a light breeze comes along and knocks it down. And if you look closely, that's what Ziblatt and Levitsky later say. What Svolik later says, basically all of political science that has studied the democratic decline of the last 10 years starts from that idea. And in the same interview, where he presents that idea, O'Donnell says something wonderful, that he notices a kind of complacency among the political class, both among detractors and supporters, and that this, O'Donnell says, is a stupidity worthy of Marie Antoinette. Why? Because there's no point of equilibrium in this process we're living through. That is, if we don't actively work to reverse this process of concentration and accumulation of capital and to counter this structural emptying of power in democracies, well, we won't have these imperfect democracies or these quasi-democracies we have now for much longer, where everything is kind of gray. No, it will very quickly deteriorate into a process of greater autocratization and less democracy. That's why it's necessary to start thinking proactively, because in this case, the trenches are useless. It's a process that already has an inertia that won't stop on its own.
Bien, ahora,
Well, now. No, not at all, Nico. All these mechanisms, you were just presenting on one hand, the structural, socio-economic dimension, and on the other, the ideological or cultural dimension, in a broad sense, the issue of social media, the use of platforms not only for selling products, but even for selling a president, for surveillance by security agencies, well, for any use of people aimed at the goals of the platform owners. And all of that gives rise to these phenomena.
Y todo eso genera el surgimiento de estos fenómenos. Ahora, una vez en...
Now, once not just in power but actually in government, these new forces, these grotesque figures, apparently also collide with the very same problems of which they are themselves a product. Because Bolsonaro, after a while, also ended up defeated by Lula. The same with Trump, after his first term. Milei, although in the midterm election he performed far better than expected. Everyone, myself included, predicted Milei's end after that midterm election. That result only delayed his fall a bit, but the fall seems, in my opinion, inevitable, precisely because of all these conditions. So, are we witnessing a paradox or not? This situation gives rise to these figures, but at the same time it also determines their downfall.
Pero a la vez, después también determina su caída.
Sí, para mí no, igual no es una paradoja, sino que se explica.
Yes, for me it's not really a paradox, but something that explains itself. The discontent with democracy is with everyone, because the truth is that neither the right nor the left is capable of meeting the demand for a life more like the one we were promised, the one our parents and grandparents had. It was like, well, yes, you worked hard, but you had some time for yourself. From that work came savings, came progress. Your child was going to be better off than you, and you were going to live better in old age than you did when you were young. That's gone. That expectation has disappeared, and neither the left nor the right can bring it back. What I think is that the left has no answer to that, and still runs on this mindset of, let's defend what little is left, let's hold on to what little remains. And so it ends up being the conservative proposal, conservative of a status quo that satisfies no one, while the right in any case says, see, it can't be done, you have to give me more power.
Ven que no se puede, me tienen que dar más poder. Ven que no se puede, hay que odiar más todavía a los
See, it can't be done. We have to hate foreigners even more. People of this or that religion, the poor, politicians, whoever. Let's say the right-wing discourse goes like this. Every time a left-wing government fails, the right says, it's because they were left-wing and not us. And every time a right-wing government fails, they say, it's because we weren't given enough power, or it's because there's still the kuka risk, as they call it here, to supposedly explain the country's risk due to the possibility that Peronism might win someday. Well, if your economic plan isn't compatible with losing elections, then you clearly don't have a democratic economic plan. But the truth is that every time the right fails, it tightens the screw a little more. And this isn't even a theoretical projection. Look, there are two cases that I think are key to understanding what's happening now with Trump, for example. They're also the two cases that serve as precedents for this far-right wave, Viktor Orban and Benjamin Netanyahu. Both Orban in Hungary and Netanyahu were presidents, lost elections, won them again, and made sure they would never lose them again.
Volvieron a ganarlas y se aseguraron no volver a perderlas nunca más. Digamos, aprendieron la lección.
Let's say they learned their lesson. And it seems to me that Trump is going through a very similar process. That idea of saying, well, this time they won't take us out. This time we'll do whatever it takes to stay here in power. And that's why, little by little, the remaining traces of a democratic mask will keep falling away more and more. And that's happening in the United States, and it's happening in Argentina too, where in addition, with this absolute subordination to the United States that Milei is showing, there's also something going on there. I agree with your assessment. Milei on his own would no longer be president. His project was finished, his plan was over. Now he's on life support from the United States. But it's a big, powerful respirator. It could last a long time. In this situation, unfortunately, because they don't lend you the respirator for free, you know?
Lamentablemente, porque no te lo presta gratis el respirador, digamos, ¿no? Pero me parece que no es paradoja.
But it seems to me that this self-destruction isn't paradoxical, so to speak, but rather part of the dynamic that they understood better than those of us on the other side, partly because they are the authors of this situation. I don't think it's a Machiavellian conspiratorial plan. It seems more like a Frankensteinian creature to me. What came out is what came out, what it could be, but they are undoubtedly the authors of this situation. And that's why they also understand it better and handle it better. But even so, they still can't provide satisfactory answers. That's why I think the aspect of surveillance, repression, and control will deepen, because along the path we're on, people aren't going to be any happier. Yes.
Sí. Por otro lado, esa faceta de represión y control.
On the other hand, that aspect of repression and control also appeared in Biden's government before, and in Obama's, as a constant. It's as if Trump perhaps shows the most visible face of all this, but the process reveals a red line, a continuity throughout all governments in the United States and around the world. You'll probably agree with this idea as well.
Seguramente acompañarás esta idea también. Más allá de eso, Nico, ya que
Beyond that, Nico, hold on before we move on to the next chapter. Because about that idea, I think there's, or at least I have, a perspective that could enrich that continuity with the nuance of difference as well. There's a lot of debate, at least here in Argentina, about whether it's right or not to call them fascists and so on. And my conclusion, after digging quite a bit into the matter, is that it wouldn't be incorrect, or it isn't incorrect, to talk about a neoliberal fascism, in the sense that neoliberalism had, if you will, a more pure or original phase, which was in the 80s with Thatcher and Reagan. It had the Clinton and Tony Blair phase, which was neoliberal, if you will, social democratic. It had the conservative neoliberal phase during the Bush era and the beginning of the war in the Middle East. It had the progressive neoliberal phase, which was everything known as woke capitalism, that is, Obamism and everything that followed. And it had the fascist neoliberal phase, or is going through the fascist neoliberal phase, which is the one we're living through now. Why? Because I think the difference is, well, there's a continuity in neoliberal disciplinary mechanisms. Unemployment, permanent austerity, obviously police violence, and so on. And to that are added the disciplinary mechanisms of 20th century authoritarianism, which for some decades seemed to be banned from the book of what's acceptable, something the United States, in any case, applied abroad, but never used on its own citizens. And what are we seeing now then? Which is, literally, concentration camps in El Salvador. What is happening, obviously, in the Gaza Strip. This characterization of political opposition through the figure of Antifa as a terrorist organization. So it can be persecuted with the same methods the United States used abroad, but now in domestic politics. And well, each country has its own particularities, but it seems to me that this is what's happening. The methods of discipline are being combined or added together. The continuity of neoliberal discipline with a resurgence of fascist mechanisms and tools to reinforce the neoliberal regime at a time when the contradictions had become so great that, with the tools they had up to that point, it wasn't enough, and they had to tighten the screws even more.
Yes, in the conception or analytical perspective, from the hegemonic centers, from the United States toward Europe, they present this contradiction or this political development as a struggle between globalism and sovereigntism. Those are the terms used. I share your perspective that it's simply a transition from the progressive neoliberalism of Biden and Kamala Harris to the reactionary neoliberalism, or however you want to call it. Yes, reactionary, of Trump. Yes, reactionary, and also of a reality show nature to a large extent. But the center of power appears in both. Let's remember that, although Trump's candidacy was initially backed by some business people supposedly tied to the US domestic market, on Inauguration Day, they were all sitting neatly in the front row. Jeff Bezos was there, Mark Zuckerberg was there, who until very recently had supported Kamala Harris's candidacy, the guys from Google, Well, all of Silicon Valley, and behind them, obviously, all of Wall Street, right? From BlackRock and Vanguard to the folks at Goldman Sachs. Now, within all this, and I could already ask 3 or 4 questions, but before getting to the bigger ones, I want to start with a slightly more specific one. Trump's stance toward Argentina, and in part, toward Latin America. What exactly does Trump want from Argentina, Nico?
Let's see, my take, based on everything that's happened in these 10 months since Trump took office, is that it's impressive because it feels like it's been years. The truth is, the start of his second presidency has been very intense. I think Trump began by trying to get ahead of China in a trade war that he didn't manage well, that he miscalculated because he had to back down. He presented it differently, but basically he had to back down. And having accepted that he can't directly confront China right now and win. And I think this is an acknowledgement from both sides, from Washington and from Beijing. It's clear that at this point the production chains, especially those related to advanced development and the technological race, are so intertwined that a conflict that escalates and breaks those chains would seriously harm both sides. Not to mention the effects on food and fuel prices, etc., which are more sensitive for the United States than for China, because there is still a much more robust civilian activity, and moreover, American civilians are much more heavily armed. So he decided to accept that the world was entering a G2 mode. In fact, after meeting with Xi Jinping in South Korea on October 30th, he himself spoke of a G2. He made a post on his social network, Truth, where he celebrated the G2 meeting. It seems to me that within that framework, which was also confirmed in subsequent phone calls, last week there was a call between Xi Jinping and Trump that, for the first time in a long while, was requested by China. Xi Jinping had never requested a call with Trump. The last time China had asked for communication with the US president was in 2001 to offer condolences after the September 11 attacks. But in general, Chinese diplomacy doesn't work that way. And it was the same afternoon that Trump was announcing the war in Venezuela, basically the declaration of the Cartel of the Suns as a foreign terrorist organization. In that conversation, Xi Jinping told Trump, "Hey, look, we're concerned about what's happening in Japan. We're worried because Japan is showing interest in Taiwan, a right-wing, far-right nationalist group, one in Japan, a candidate who is questioning demilitarization, and so on and so on and so on." Trump hung up, called Japan and said, "Hey, I was calling to let you know that we're getting along very well with China right now." And that, in a way, is also a green light for Trump to do whatever he wants in Latin America up to a certain point, right? As long as he doesn't seriously compromise some of China's interests. He's not going to mess with the ports in Brazil or Peru. But yes, in principle, with Venezuela, let's say a kind of 21st century Yalta, that's what Trump is aiming for. I think China sees things differently, but Trump wants to break multilateralism. That's why he's trying to dismantle the G20. That's why he's hollowing out all the multilateral spaces, so that, in any case, he can tell China, you don't mess with me on this, and I won't mess with you on that. Negotiating one-on-one. Trump is a historic negotiator. In that scenario, Trump believes that all of the Americas fall within the sphere of influence of the United States, of course, based on the Monroe Doctrine. He is particularly interested in Argentina, I think, for 2 reasons. One is its natural resources: lithium, copper, rare earths, and gas, its gas reserves. And the other is the strategic interoceanic passage through the Bering Strait and the south of Tierra del Fuego, which is the only military passage between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Because the Panama Canal has no military use, it cannot have military use. It wasn't designed for that. It would take weeks for an army to cross, leaving it vulnerable. An army, a navy, a fleet. It would be absolutely vulnerable. It's not feasible. And the northern route remains a much more, although climate change and melting ice have been opening new paths, it is still a much more unpredictable route. So for the United States, it's crucial in a potential future conflict scenario with China, in a world divided with China, to control the naval passage between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. In that sense, its strategic interest is absolute, absolutely so. The issue is the way it approaches that strategic interest. There are many possible tactics. Milei offers the easiest one in the world, which is, I'll give you everything in exchange for nothing, or in exchange for a little push to help me reach the elections. But beyond Milei, I think the idea that the United States had lost interest in Latin America and didn't care much about what was happening in Argentina is now obsolete. From now on, we'll have to live with the curse of being a country of strategic interest to the United States. Because the truth is, those stories usually don't end well. They usually don't end well. People often point to the so-called virtuous examples of Israel or South Korea, which aren't really virtuous at all. They just happen to have, if you will, some positive externalities. But the truth is, it's far more likely we'll end up like some Central American or African country. And that's not meant as an insult to them, but rather a reflection of the colonial behavior those countries have suffered. Then like Germany, which is what libertarians imagine, that will become Germany in 30 years, or something like that. On the other hand, I wouldn't want to live in Germany 30 years from now. The next 30 years won't be easy for Germany. But anyway, that's another matter.
Yes, on the other hand, obviously not only the libertarians, but the categories of political analysis about Europe are 40 years behind in Latin America. Today, Germany represents an example of everything negative, not of the welfare state or all that fantasy about Europe, Germany and the global north. But beyond that, Nico, come on. And this follows a certain logic, right? We started with Argentina, and suddenly more and more topics keep coming up. But above all, an increasingly broader perspective.
Pero por sobre todas las cosas una perspectiva cada vez más amplia. Y en esa perspectiva aparecen, lógicamente, como contrapunto de Estados Unidos.
And from that perspective, China, India, Russia, the BRICS logically appear as a counterpoint to the United States. In that context, where should Argentina appear, and where should Latin America appear? Because all these changes logically are also tied to deeper geopolitical transformations, moving toward, well, some call it multipolarity, others call it multicentrality, others multinodality. Different concepts, but more or less similar kinds of change. In your opinion, where should we begin to set our course in this situation?
Well, you mentioned a while ago this apparent dichotomy between nationalism and globalism, which seems to be the great dividing line of our time, depending on one's perspective, even from both sides, since there are theorists with that view on each side. And there really are two sides to all this. And you know that we Argentinians have the immense fortune of being Argentinian, which, like all fortunes in old legends and mythologies, comes with a built-in curse, right? There's no blessing that doesn't come with fine print. But beyond soccer, beyond other matters, it seems to me that Argentina is in a privileged position today to start thinking about how to face everything that's happening. Why do I say this? Because the central idea of any organization that moving forward aims to confront this neoliberal, fascist, far-right international, or whatever you want to call it, which is currently growing in the West, is social justice. They say it themselves. They put a lot of effort into discrediting social justice, into saying it's something bad, but the truth is that it is what conceptually opposes the neoliberal individualism and anarcho-capitalism they promote, which are dehumanizing and so on.
tenemos experiencia en...
And we, Argentinians, have experience in social justice. And we had here someone who, besides having been president of Argentina, and who, in the exercise of power, had his highs and lows like anyone who has held power, was also a very important writer and political theorist, Juan Perón. He wrote extensively about social justice, conceptualized it, and provided frameworks that are still very useful today. Not from a nostalgic place tied to a doctrine that no longer applies to a very different reality, but from practice.
Sino desde la práctica. Entre otras cuestiones,
Among other issues, he argued that the central dichotomy of the 20th century was between the liberal individualism of capitalism and the dehumanizing statism of the Soviet Union, where people took on the role of insects without personality. He said that between individualism and collectivism, there is a third historical position, a third way, which is the organized community, a community where the individual fulfills themselves, but not on their own, rather through sharing with those who build a common life. I believe that this view, dialectical if you will, of the 20th century conflict can be brought into the present. And today, the conflict that seems most important is that of globalism versus nationalism. And I think we need to consider a third position. Why? On one hand, because the experience of neoliberal globalism taught us that the best way to defend the sovereignty of nations, and to ensure that each nation can decide what is best for its people, is precisely to keep control and decision-making over certain aspects of each country's life in the hands of that nation's democracy. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, humanity's great challenge today is capital. And it's a globalized capital that cannot be fought country by country, because if you try to fight capital in your own country, the whole system is set up so that capital can stage a coup and topple you, trigger a financial run and wreck you, move to a country that offers 2 points less in taxes and leave you flat on your back, or keep producing in your country, but take the money somewhere else. That is to say, there is no national solution to the problem of capital. The problem of capital today is a global problem. So it seems to me that the model to think about is that of an organized community of nations, where each nation individually fulfills itself through communion with the others. And the BRICS, which many criticize, look, it's nothing, it has no rules, no structure, it's neither a customs union, nor a trade union, nor a military alliance. Well, what is BRICS? It's an organized community of nations. They are nations that come together without giving up sovereignty over their own internal affairs to jointly address global issues that none of them can solve on their own.
Para resolver juntas cuestiones globales que no pueden resolver cada una por sí misma. Por ejemplo, la desdolarización.
For example, de-dollarization. For example, how to manage, as a planet, the transition from American hegemony to a multipolar world without that meaning a war that blows everything to pieces. I mean, there are a lot of factors that are too big to be dealt with country by country, but that doesn't mean giving up nationalism as a tool for each country's sovereignty in relation to capital. So, for people to once again prevail over capital, a battle we've been losing for half a century, we need both the nation-state and a strong community of nations in the world willing to fight this battle.
Bien, generaste una conexión interesante entre la teoría de la tercera posición.
Well, you drew an interesting connection between Perón's third position theory and the BRICS. Specifically, if I understand your words correctly, in your opinion, Argentina should take a turn toward the BRICS, toward China, toward Russia, toward India, without abandoning its own national interest, that of the Argentine people. And this, of course, could be extended to all Latin American countries on the continent. Am I interpreting your words correctly, making an accurate summary? Nico?
Yes, I'd go even further. I think it's something that all countries in the world should start considering if they believe that the dignity of their people's lives is more important than capital. because that's the battle we have ahead of us.
Esa es la batalla que tenemos por delante.
Nico, ¿y cuál es el rol del Estado en todo esto? Porque más
Nico, and what is the role of the state in all this? Because beyond, I don't want to call it autism, since a comment like that once drew criticism, and rightly so, from one of the critics, as it understandably stigmatizes people with autism. Beyond the fantasy in which Argentina's political culture finds itself, with Milei and the hegemonic media portraying the United States as the pinnacle of the world, when in reality it is undergoing total and absolute decline, economically, politically, and socially. Beyond that, around the world, the countries that are currently making this transition toward a new phase of capitalism successfully have different models, but in all of them, the state appears as a fundamental factor.
Pero en todos ellos el Estado aparece como un factor fundamental, comenzando por China, con un...
Starting with China, which has a very particular hybrid economic system, we could describe it as a neoliberal private economy, but with a communist party that sets limits when that neoliberal economy begins to generate crises that spiral out of control. The state, as seen for example during the Evergrande real estate crisis at the time, immediately set a limit to that crisis. Housing production resumed, but the chapter of financial speculation was closed. In Russia's case, a good portion of strategic companies are also in state hands.
Empresas estratégicas aparecen también en poder del Estado, y no solamente las militares, sino por sobre todas las cosas.
And not only the military ones, but above all, the oil and gas companies, the energy sector. The United States itself, even though Milei presents Friedman's monetary theory here as the latest novelty of hegemonic American thought, the United States itself is carrying out nationalizations, not only of arms-producing companies, but also of parts of NVIDIA, the chip manufacturer, of Intel. It's making announcements for programs, well, for artificial intelligence super servers. Clearly the state, is it reappearing, or am I misinterpreting all this, Nico?
Cometo un error de interpretación, Nico, en todo esto.
Mira, no y sí, perdón.
Look, yes and no. Sorry, right? But to frame an answer with two perspectives. Yes, you're right that there's a process in which states are intervening very openly in key matters, especially in the technological race, not just by acquiring shares. I don't know if you saw the news, but a few months ago you probably did. The Pentagon swore in executives from Meta, Amazon, Palantir, and some of those corporations as army generals. Because things are so intertwined that in order to share state secrets necessary for development, they brought them in. Obviously, there's a symbolism that makes it seem like the state is taking over or absorbing that part of capital. I think the dynamic is actually the other way around, but anyway, there's an obvious symbiosis there.
Pero bueno, ahí hay una simbiosis que es evidente. De hecho, me acuerdo hace unos meses cuando...
In fact, I remember a few months ago when Donald Trump got into a fight with Elon Musk on Twitter, that some hasty interpretations said, well, the alliance between the alt-right and Silicon Valley has broken. Because obviously there are tensions there, right? And Bannon doesn't get along with Musk or Thiel or any of them and so on. And the truth is that the White House, Washington in general, the Pentagon, can't afford to fight with Silicon Valley right now because they're running an existential race against China, and the wheels of that vehicle are Silicon Valley, and the engine of that vehicle is Silicon Valley. For the United States, fighting with Silicon Valley would be equivalent to giving up any claim to compete for a share of power in the world. So no, they are inseparable from one another. I said yes and no, and I want to emphasize that I don't see a resurgence of the state, but rather a state that never stopped being there, taking on new roles. Why do I say it never stopped being there?
¿Por qué digo que nunca dejó de estar ahí? Yo entiendo que la principal diferencia entre el...
I understand that the main difference between traditional liberalism and neoliberalism is that traditional liberalism said, the market operates in a kind of equilibrium if left alone, and therefore it is desirable to let do and let pass, as the liberal slogan went. In the post-war period after World War II, that paradigm became obsolete because all the world's economies, from the most capitalist to the most socialist, had adopted forms of government with strongly centralized economic development and had obviously been more successful with those forms of governance. So capital, in order to counter the growing power of workers, because that was the issue, when you discuss the distribution of money, you're also discussing the distribution of power, abandons the liberal paradigm of non-intervention by the state, of the less state the better, and says, no, what we need is a state that guarantees the conditions for us to do business, that ensures the ideal conditions for capital to multiply and accumulate, that lowers taxes, removes trade barriers, but also intervenes where necessary with a subsidy or by imposing a tariff barrier to prevent the entry of hostile capital from a country with which there is no strategic partnership. Well, neoliberalism has been statist in its own way from the very beginning, since the 80s. The form of that statism has evolved, and in this era we see its most blatant version. But there is a stronger intervention of capital than ever before to ensure capital accumulation, because the more extreme that accumulation becomes, the more unsustainable social coexistence becomes, and the more power you need to give the state to create the mechanisms that guarantee the system keeps functioning. Mechanisms of control, repression, but also of ensuring, for example, that these large economic corporations have the cash flow they need to keep going. OpenAI, which was supposedly the company that was going to change the world, is facing some very serious financial troubles. The big platforms work because they sell advertising and have very lucrative government contracts. They still haven't found another way to make money. In other words, they haven't yet been able to turn their technological advances into a productivity improvement that allows them to earn the kind of money that would justify the investment they're making.
Bien. Y en este contexto, y de vuelta.
All right. And in this context, going back to, how can Argentina establish, or in other words, how can it reposition its stance within this new framework, if our ruling classes are not only economically and ideologically tied to the ruling classes in the United States, but also completely lack any national drive for development? Something, by the way, increasingly visible in the global north as well. We must not forget the current situation of the national bourgeoisies in Europe. It's quite evident. They've been harmed by the war in Ukraine, yet they remain silent. And on the other hand, in the case of the ruling classes in the United States, they sometimes create the impression that people like Peter Thiel, Zuckerberg, the manager of Oracle, what was his name again? Larry? Yes, but no, not Ellis. Well, something like that. Or Ellison, if I remember correctly. Anyway, more and more they present a profile detached from the idea of a nation, even with delusions like this transhumanism thing, people living on Mars. What is the way to overcome that? Shouldn't we focus more on other issues, on other varieties of capitalism, such as in Russia, in China, or perhaps even in some other experiences, like the Korean development of the 1960s? How do we respond to these changes with these ruling classes? Maybe that's the most concise summary of my question.
Quizás es el resumen más sintético de mi pregunta.
A ver, qué buena pregunta. Es una pregunta importantísima.
Let's see. That's a great question. It's a very important question. To begin with, we have to say that we'll necessarily have to convince them of some things. And even if it seems difficult, we'll have to do it. And for the things we can't convince them of, we'll have to go ahead and do them anyway, even if they don't like it. If we move at the pace they propose, we won't get anywhere. That said, it seems to me that the process of capital accumulation at the very, very, very top of the pyramid, we're no longer talking about the 1% as the Indignados said 15 years ago. We're often talking about the 0.0001%.
Del 0,00001% muchas veces. Lo que Branko Milanovic llama una nueva forma de capitalismo.
What Branko Milanovic calls a new form of capitalism, in which the rich workers and the rich capitalists are the same people. Because there are these extremely high salaries of corporate mega managers and so on, and that makes wealth concentrate more and more and more. It leads to the formation of this caste, this true caste, which, as I was saying a moment ago, I think deserves to be called lumpen. They are stateless and classless. They don't see other wealthy sectors, other millionaires, as their equals. When Elon Musk is building a rocket to Mars, he's not thinking of inviting Taylor Swift onto that rocket, let's say. There's no sense of class solidarity he's thinking about. On the other hand, we should start worrying that the richest people in the world are building rockets to take off to Mars, right? But that's another issue.
Pero ese es otro tema. Aunque no es otro tema, porque estamos en una época, además.
Although it's not a separate issue, we are living in a time of such technological frontier that if this concentration of capital, which has no natural or theoretical limits, something Piketty demonstrated and is already well known, is not somehow reversed. And when I say somehow, I mean politically, we will find ourselves in a number of years that no one can predict. It could be 50, but it could also be 10, because the truth is that technological progress is accelerating enormously. In a scenario where technology allows human life to be extended 200, 300, 500, or more years, whether by replacing organs with new ones, printed or grown, or by transferring our consciousness from biological bodies to machines. All ideas that are now common among that Silicon Valley elite you mentioned. Speculations that, for them, are not science fiction, but real projects within their own lifetimes. People who are 50 or 60 years old. In other words, we're talking about something very near, and obviously these are technological advances that will not be democratized or universalized.
Que no se van a democratizar ni universalizar. Entonces el riesgo que se corre es de que exista un.
So, the risk we face is that there could be a group of thousands, 10,000, 50,000, it doesn't matter how many, but still a very, very small fraction of the population living in increasingly isolated environments. Think about gated communities in Latin America. Think about the social structures in Arab kingdoms like Dubai and others, where you have the mega skyscrapers, where the citizens, about 10% of the population live, and the rest live practically in servitude. Or, if we go to more extreme cases, those bunkers that all these super millionaires are building to survive in case of a global conflict, while the rest of the population, not so well, right? It's a scenario, which I insist, seems like science fiction, but if you project it forward, it's the most likely one if rapid changes aren't made. And in that scenario, the rich, not the super rich, not that caste, but the people who are successful entrepreneurs, athletes, artists who made it big, drug traffickers, whatever. I'm not going to ask how you made your life, but you're someone who has a mansion, maybe a yacht, 4 or 5 cars, that's great. You're closer to our lives, or even to ending up one day living under a bridge, than to becoming one of those who will live in their walled citadel. There are 2 clear examples of this, in my view.
Hay dos ejemplos claros de esto para mí. Uno es el caso de Luigi Mangione.
One case is that of Luis Imayone. Do you remember him? The guy who shot the executive of the largest insurance company in the United States 3 times in the back. Luis Imayone wasn't a delivery guy. He wasn't someone who spent 18 hours a day pedaling just to survive precariously. He came from one of the richest families in Maryland. His parents owned gated communities, his uncles owned radio stations, and he had a cousin who was a Republican congressman. Now, a permanent back injury was enough to get him caught up in a capitalist bureaucracy that would make Stalin pale, and in which his millions were worth nothing.
Y en la cual sus millones no valieron nada. Es decir, excepto que tengas tanta guita.
That is, unless you have so much money that you can set up a hospital in one wing of your house, like many people tried to do during the pandemic when they tried to buy ventilators just in case, you're screwed, even if you're part of one of the richest families in Maryland. The second example was the fires in Malibu this year, where the homes of all the Hollywood stars and others went up in flames. Those fires are caused by climate change, which is largely being driven or greatly accelerated, beyond the fact that human activity in general has a lot to do with it. But nowadays it's being sped up even more by the energy, electricity, water, and other consumption of the specific industries of those 5, 10, 20, 50 people. And your mansion's gonna catch fire, man, if you don't put a stop to this. Like I always say, the goal should be to have more rich people, not fewer. But these guys are absorbing so much and accumulating so much that even those who are traditionally wealthy are being exposed to the dangers of this 21st century state of unrest, to climate change, to the fury that might come when people get fed up one day and go out to take over their mansions. I don't know, anything could happen. They're not going to make it. The ones who will make it are Elon Musk and his crew. There's a reason all of Elon Musk's cars are built to survive the apocalypse. Why is he preparing for that? Clearly he's preparing for it, and he's not going to invite Paulo Rocca. He's not going to invite those who think they're his equals just because they have successful businesses. That's why I think the class war is already over, and the rich won. What Warren Buffett said back then, he said it in 2006, we're winning. I think after the 2008 crisis, they finished winning it. That's when that war ended. And what we're living through now is something else. That it is directly capital itself, almost like an idea that took on a life of its own, which is part of the conceptualization made by the far right, the accelerationists, Nick Land and others. They present capital as a rhizome that self-replicates, that already has life in itself, like a virus, an idea virus against humanity. The fact that capital still, for a few more years, uses 50, 100, or 10,000 humans to carry out its tasks of accumulation, replication, and concentration does not mean that this is a war of people against people. That stage is over. It is a war of humanity to survive, for planet Earth to survive, against a capital that is going through a stage of destroying everything in order to keep accumulating, growing, multiplying, and concentrating. At least that's how I see it.
Yes, paraphrasing the old and beloved Nemo, I wanted to recall, Nico, the example of what was, until recently, at least the richest man in Argentina. Marcos Galperin, owner of Mercado Libre. He isn't even a resident of Argentina. He's been living in Uruguay for many years now. And his wealth is also held in a fund in New Zealand, right? So in a way, when it comes to the Latin American ruling classes, well, the idea of Mars isn't present yet, as it is for Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, but the idea of escaping their countries, the inequality in their countries, and the risks tied to that inequality, and the flight of capital, certainly is. Yes, you made a very good assessment of the situation, but you didn't present the magic formula for Argentina to create new ruling classes to replace these. But no one can present that. And besides, ultimately, it's more of a political struggle than a theoretical one, though that too. But anyway.
But I'll go back to the beginning of the answer because I think it's important to emphasize that. First, we have to try to convince them as much as possible. And once that stage is exhausted, we have to move forward anyway, because we can't depend on them, so to speak. Survival is at stake.
Yes, no doubt about that. Just now, with your analysis of the crisis of capitalism and the end of the class struggle, I was reminded of Giovanni Arrighi's theory. He was an economist from the World Systems School, Immanuel Wallerstein's school, basically historians, scholars, or students of Braudel, a French historian devoted to the longue durée, to long-term processes. This man Arrighi argued that in every crisis of the different phases of capitalist accumulation, and, by the way, for world systems theorists, capitalism does not begin with the British Industrial Revolution, as Marx would apparently suggest, but rather begins earlier, in the long 16th century, with the establishment of states through the colonization of the Americas, the creation of a world system, a world economy, and the beginning of the first schemes of expanded accumulation on a global scale.
De los primeros esquemas de acumulación ampliada a escala global, para él primero aparece un capitalismo.
For him, capitalism first appears as one dominated by generous capitalists, and the end of that first phase presents three moments. Always, in the final moment, we witness a phase of financialization. The financialization of that Genoese capitalism appears precisely in the Genoese lenders to the Spanish crown for Columbus's voyage, but something similar happens later in the phase of capitalism led by Dutch capitalists. We see the same thing at the end of the British Empire, when British industrialists disappear, and above all, the City of London comes into action as the reconversion of British capitalism.
La reconversión del capitalismo británico, y según Arrighi, comenzó con el neoliberalismo.
And according to Arrighi, it began with neoliberalism in the United States. That phase of financialization as the final stage of capitalism dominated by the US. And as a new phase of capitalism, China emerges in its productive stage. Whenever the financialization of one phase of capitalism declines, another one appears. So in this context, where does China appear economically in this situation? And shouldn't we, if that really is the sequence, make a shift in terms of positioning in the global market directly toward China, completely abandoning the United States?
Directamente hacia China, abandonando por completo a Estados Unidos?
Mira, me parece que.
Look, it seems to me that China clearly represents the next stage of capitalism, if you want to call it that. Beyond the fact that I know Chinese people who would argue to the death that they're not capitalists, we're not going to get into semantic debates, because I'm not well versed enough in the subject to take a firm stand either way. I do think, though, that the order of factors is no small thing. That is, even in a free market system, or one with a certain level of free market and private ownership by individuals and companies, it makes a big difference whether it's capital or the state that controls things. I think that's an extremely important factor. It seems to me that for Argentina in particular, and for any other peripheral actor, and in that sense, to some extent, we might even have to ask whether Europe is one in this new stage. It's necessary to act with very sharp strategic intelligence in pursuit of specific interests and long-term national goals in order to find an autonomous position in the world of active non-alignment, as it was called in the 20th century. I don't believe that Argentina, nor Europe for that matter, could turn their backs on the United States from one day to the next.
Darle la espalda a Estados Unidos de un día para otro. No creo tampoco que sea deseable, no creo que sea ni siquiera lo que.
I also don't think it's desirable. I don't even think it's what the population of Latin America or Western Europe wants. Because the truth is there's a weight from the cultural apparatus, from cultural hegemony, from many generations, from shared origins, even in migratory terms, well, and so on and so on. Yes, we must understand that the balance point is moving closer and closer to China and farther from the United States, but in a gradual process. Without a doubt, that's the case.
Sin ninguna duda eso. Por otro lado,
on the other hand, I think there are points of contact between the Chinese model and the North American model, in that both are tending toward corporatism. Because in this world, let's say, where once again there don't seem to be any rules of the game, the accumulation of power through the corporate model hasn't found a replacement. In one case, a corporatism with a state foundation, in the other, a corporatism with a private foundation. It seems to me that, for Argentina at least, which is the case I know in depth, neither of the two models is directly exportable. I find it amusing when people say, well, we have to do what China does. No one can do what China does, because the Chinese model, long before being Marxist, Maoist, Deng Xiaopingist, Xi Jinpingist, or whatever, is Chinese. And it's based on a way of seeing the community, of seeing others, of seeing the country, the nation, its place in the world that goes back thousands of years. There's no way to reproduce it elsewhere. There's no way to export that. The point for me, and it's not a minor one at all, quite the opposite, it's key, is that China dismantles the argument at the heart of the neoliberal project, which is Margaret Thatcher's famous phrase, "There is no alternative." Because the neoliberal project doesn't tell you we're good, it tells you we do what we have to do, we do what's necessary, because anything else is unthinkable. The deepening of that is what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism, this idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, and so on, which paradoxically happens in the West at the same time that a different, much more successful model emerges in the world, the Chinese one, even by capitalism's own standards. Whether it's capitalist or not, leaving that deeper discussion aside. So it's a deception, it's gaslighting to tell you there is no alternative. And finally, that deception is collapsing because of the results China is achieving in its development. In politics, unlike in mathematics, the difference between 0 and 1 is infinitely greater than the difference between 1, 2, 3, 1,000, 10,000. The difference between there is no alternative and there is an alternative is an abyss. Now, once there is an alternative that works in China, why couldn't there be 2, 3, 1,000 alternatives? One that works for Argentinians, based on the characteristics, traditions, and history of the Argentine people. Another one for the Brazilians, another one for the Europeans, all together or each on their own, depending on how they decide. Another one for the Mexicans, another one for the Indians. But for that to be possible, it's necessary for countries to form an organized community to fight against capital. Because if they don't, every country that tries to develop its own alternative will find that its country risk shoots up to 5,000, default, the currency devalues, costs drop, the government falls, and they install the puppet of the moment to maintain the status quo. So that's where what I was telling you before comes up again, the importance of national development, but within a global context of struggle against capital.
Yes, the fight against capital typical of the United States, because country risk, financial operations, and the International Monetary Fund all represent an expression of that capital. But Chinese investments, those of the BRICS, or the creation of new financial institutions, also appear as part of capital, only non-interventionist. In that sense, your label of fight against capital, right?
Let's see, there's a phrase attributed to Deng Xiaoping, I think it's apocryphal, that's why I'm clarifying, but it says something like, the market is an excellent servant and a terrible master. I was telling you a while ago, two corporate models, one with a capitalist, or rather private foundation, and another with a state foundation. I believe that capital is a tool humanity has developed, and that it has been very valuable. Because the truth is that, whether we measure it over the last 300 years using the Marxist yardstick, or over the last 500 if we use the measure of long processes, so to speak, we're talking about the most incredible stage of development in human history. Not only in technological terms, that we can have this conversation or whatever, but also in terms of quantity and quality of life, of the multiplication of years of life and the quality of those years, of the literacy of millions of billions of people, and so on and so forth. And all of that was also achieved thanks to the tool of capital, which made it possible to take trade beyond bartering, which enabled a lot of other things. I don't reject that tool. I think that in the last 50 years, that tool stopped being a tool and started being the master. Look, Milei says he's an anarcho-capitalist.
Mira, Milei dice que es anarcocapitalista. Y yo creo que una definición muy acertada.
And I think that's a very accurate definition, because what anarcho-capitalism really means is a system without rules for capital, where capital can move in and out of all countries without giving explanations or having to pay anything. It can do whatever it wants, launder itself, go underground. It's about freeing capital from any ties to politics or to people. And to free capital, what must be done is to subjugate humanity, to subjugate people, to make them work 16 hours a day, to leave them without a future, without a decent life, to dismantle the welfare state that at some point, partially but seemingly, provided a social framework that didn't leave anyone behind.
No dejar a nadie afuera. Contra todo eso, el capital.
Against all that, capital, over the last 50 years, has worked to undo all those chains that bound it and that allowed people to be freer. And today we live in a world where capital is freer and people are less so. And not only in practice, but even conceptually. There was an announcement, let's see, there's an American philosopher, Wendy Brown, who has a couple of very interesting works, and she identifies a turning point in this process in 2012 with the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that removed limits on private campaign financing through super PACs. And what she says is that beyond the economic effect this had, what it did was grant the right of free expression to capital. Because the Supreme Court's argument was that placing limits on the amount of money that could be invested in a campaign was a restriction on freedom of speech. So then, freedom of expression for everyone no longer had the same value. It depended on how much money each person had. Rights and qualities that were intrinsically human were transferred to capital. A few months ago, here in Argentina, Milei made an announcement that really resonated with that passage from Brown, because he announced two measures. One was the historical reparation of Argentinian savings, where he revived a concept that was originally meant for retirees. Even though it wasn't a good measure, it was the historical reparation for retirees. The subject was retirees, people, vulnerable people. And now the subject of the right to this reparation becomes capital savings. And in the same press conference, they announced the principle of fiscal innocence. Again, the presumption of innocence is something that people have by virtue of their human dignity. And the logic of these governments transfers it to capital. That is, it's not about fighting capital to eliminate it, as some sectors of Marxist communism proposed in the 20th century. It's about fighting capital to put it in chains and turn it back into a tool for humanity. Because today humans are instruments of capital in its infinite accumulation, and a very disposable instrument at that. That, I would say, is the core of the conflict for me.
Perfect. Yes, I just remembered. Speaking of contradictions, can you stay a little longer, Nico? I think so.
If I hear Greta talking, I'll let you know and come to the rescue.
Well, mine has already fallen asleep, so... Yes, I was just remembering, speaking of the contradictions of the freedom of capital, the greatest contradiction of the supposed emancipation of capital and the freedom of capital, that essential contradiction that if the state disappears, capitalism disappears, because private property disappears.
Of course.
Milei often forgets this as one of the conditions for the existence of capital. But anyway, beyond that, there are many questions about different issues. I don't want to ask about the war in Ukraine yet. First, I want to ask about the so-called woke ideology. Because just as you're presenting these ideas, and we on this channel present very similar ones, though a bit less from a geo-economic angle, and more from a geopolitical one, the interpretive line is very similar to yours. In today's prevailing political culture, in current debates, conversations like ours and these perspectives come across as basic Chinese. Nowadays, debates and political disputes not only in central countries, but also, for example, in Argentina, revolve around issues like trans people, yes or no, LGBTQI, yes or no, mixed bathrooms, yes or no, trans athletes, yes or no, or, well, all these kinds of discussions, even regarding race and gender, environmentalism, yes or no, globalism or sovereigntism. From our standpoint, Nico, from the Popular Front, with this interpretation of the malaise in culture, what relationship do we establish with the so-called woke ideology? On one hand, a large part of activism and political efforts appear there, but on the other hand, we witness the risk of a turn toward progressive neoliberalism, where the focus of debates shifts to those issues and not to the deeper structural ones. So what is our stance on that, from your perspective, Nico?
Nuestra postura respecto a eso en tu perspectiva, Nico.
En principio tengo que decir que no veo.
At first, I have to say that I don't see a contradiction between one thing and the other. This interpretation, which is quite common here in Argentina at least, sets progressivism against another identity that, honestly, I don't know what it is. For me, all those debates, whether the left or the right are outdated concepts or not, are semantic debates. For me, as I said, there's a kind of people who are the ones who work, and politics, or what divides the world, is that work. But that can never be an excuse to discriminate, to generate violence, to... I think what's interesting about the concept of social justice is that it manages to bring the two struggles together a bit.
Las dos luchas, la lucha, si se quiere, principal.
The struggle, if you will, the main one, which is undoubtedly a materialist struggle and has to do with how money, power, and so on are distributed, comes with the idea that all of that ultimately has the purpose of making us freer. That is, if we fight to work fewer hours, earn more money, have vacations, bonuses, guarantees, and so on, it's because we want to be free and have control over our own lives. Then, we can't go around telling people what to do with the money they manage to save, thanks to their good salary, with their free time, their vacations, and so on. That's completely out of place, because the working class is made up of those very minorities. So what's the problem?
Por esas minorías. ¿Cuál es el problema? Cuando se ven los derechos de esa minoría desde una óptica identitaria.
When the rights of those minorities are viewed from an identity-based perspective, where the radicalization of political thought involves reaffirming your own identity and what sets you apart from others, rather than your individuality within a larger collective that includes you. Woke capitalism, or progressive neoliberalism, is not the main reason why the left has abandoned other, more important debates. As many say, no, this is the feminists' fault. No, it's the consequence. There was a huge void because neoliberalism had won the battle, because Fukuyama was wrong, but those on this side bought into it even more than those on the other, so to speak. Because as we said a moment ago, there was still a class war going on, but there was only one aggressor side and the other didn't even realize it.
Y me parece que en todo caso lo que hay que hacer entonces es recuperar.
And it seems to me that in any case, what needs to be done is to recover a core of ideas and actions that have to do with solving the underlying problem, which is this struggle against capital, or to contain or control capital. But that can never be an excuse to go back to models of violence or subjugation, whether by gender, race, religion, or anything else, that we've left behind, and that it was clearly progress to have left behind. Look, there's an author, an Italian historian who I think is currently based in Spain, in Barcelona, named Stephen Forti, who studies the new right-wing movements. He has a couple of very interesting books on the subject and raises that point more or less, you know.
Y plantea un poco eso, digamos, ¿no? Él lo que plantea es que hay un...
What he's arguing is that, in this time of so much ideological confusion, there's a phenomenon we need to be very cautious about, which he calls red-brownism, based on what the Red Browns or Nazi Bolsheviks were back in Germany in the 1930s. Basically, these are discourses that use terminology and values that are very important to the left, taking advantage of ideological confusion to serve the interests of the right. thereby discriminating and re-establishing systems of domination that have already been overcome, and so on. There are many examples of this. You can see it a lot on social media too, right? That proud doctrinaire nostalgia for a time when men wore suits and tailcoats and women stayed at home. Well, that's the past.
Bueno, ese es el pasado. Y la verdad es que la solución y la respuesta nunca está en el pasado.
And the truth is that the solution and the answer are never in the past. History shows that no progress is made by giving up past achievements in exchange for something else. On the contrary, we must build upon those achievements to keep moving forward. We must build now, with all those women, with sexual minorities, with all races, with all religions, a new consciousness of class or of humanity, of a shared destiny that allows us to face the struggle ahead. If we divide ourselves into identities, whether on the left, through this neoliberal capitalism with identity awareness, so to speak, or on the right, through the old identities that promote nationalism, racism, and so on, well, we lose that idea of, that is, what prevails is the neoliberal logic of individualism.
Lo que se impone es la lógica neoliberal del individualismo. La identidad como centro de la política.
Identity as the center of politics is individualistic. It restricts rather than expands. Identity must have political value, but within the framework of a shared consciousness. We're all on the same side. We're all kicking the same ball. And I think what's happening now proves it. The achievements of the last 5 years of the previous decade, in terms of gender progress and so on, which seemed like they were here to stay, well, once the working class was broken and this far right came to power, they didn't last even 6 months. In the United States, Trump undid them in a breath. Milei here too. There are no minority rights that can endure in the long term within this neoliberal fascist project. If that core isn't fought, all minorities are destined to suffer, and probably to suffer before others.
Y probablemente a sufrir antes que otros.
Bien, la última, Nico. La guerra.
All right, the last one, Nico. The war in Ukraine. In this whole interpretive framework of yours, where does it appear? With what effect? What does it respond to? How do you fit it into your analysis?
Dentro de tu análisis.
Y me parece que se tiene que leer como uno de los.
And it seems to me that this has to be read as one of the first or one of the strongest symptoms of the breakdown of that fiction that was international law after the fall of the wall, right? Of that hegemonic law where the United States more or less dictated the rules and so on. There was a challenge to that hegemony and to that international law that acknowledged a prior situation, that recognized that such a step could be taken without suffering the consequences it would have had at another time, or that those consequences had weakened and were bearable because the system they relied on was no longer as robust. I mean, because the same sanctions that Russia faced at the beginning of the invasion were not light. It seems to me that the systems they relied on were no longer as robust. SWIFT, probably removing Russia from SWIFT 10 years ago, would have been much more disastrous than it turned out to be 3 years ago, because the world had changed. And there's an acknowledgement of that. Then yes, I do think it has to do with unresolved historical processes, with the United States, with how it advanced toward the Russian border since the 90s and so on. But I think that's it. An important power like Russia, recognizing that the world had changed and taking advantage of those changes for itself. And by doing so, letting everyone know that things had changed, so to speak. That idea that had been somewhat underground, that this global balance of the last 25 or 30 years was collapsing. Well, once the invasion of Ukraine happened and unfolded the way it did, the emperor was left naked, and it became clear that we live in a different world system. And well, from that point on, what happened in the Middle East happened. What's happening in the Pacific is happening in the war in Ukraine. That, I think, exposed the change of scene.
Bien.
Well, Nico, what a great conversation, a pleasure for everyone. Remember Nico's podcast on El Destape, a very important outlet among the critical media in Argentina. The podcast is called Estado de Malestar. Don't miss it. And not just for the Democrats. All of this is on YouTube, not only for Argentine listeners, but it's interesting for any Spanish-speaking person, without a doubt. By the way, remember to support us with a like. In 15 minutes, 13 minutes now, Juan Antonio Aguilar's show starts on our sister channel, MP Geopolítica. Don't miss it. Nico, here as tradition has it, the closing always goes to the guest. So if there's anything left unsaid, or if you want to do a bit of self-promotion, whatever you like, the floor is yours.
Well, there's not much left to say. We talked quite a bit. It was really good. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'd just like to say that I believe we're at a turning point in history, both for these generations and probably for humanity as a whole, and that the way out of the problems we're going through won't be individual, it will be collective. The work I do on the podcast is precisely a contribution to those debates, to trying to figure things out, as we say here in Argentina, to see what the solution might be, or which way it could go. And that it's never going to be an individual solution. It's not about an enlightened individual, but rather about exchange. That's why I invite you to read it, listen to it, watch it, make whatever comments you want, and invite me wherever you like to debate. I'm completely open to it. Thank you for the opportunity to have these debates and to share my points of view. And to everyone watching this who found it enriching, let's stay in touch and keep discussing and debating together how to move forward, because I think there's nothing more important to talk about right now.
I completely agree with your words. Nico, please don't leave the broadcast. We'll wrap it up here. Demolishers, see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao. Yeah.